The papacy is something that is probably the most argued about part of the Catholic faith, both by Catholics and Protestants alike. And it normally revolves around the argument of, is the Pope who Catholics say that he is the Pope in the papacy even found in Scripture? And I think that when we dive into Scripture a little bit, and when we look at exactly what the Catholic faith says that the Pope actually is, we can find answers to both of those questions, and it actually doesn't take that much research at all. First of all, a lot of people talk about how they think that Catholics think that the Pope is completely infallible, that he can do no wrong, that everything that the Pope says we have to accept as 100% truth. And this is something that just isn't true. In the Catechism, it actually talks about how the Pope is only considered to be infallible if he speaks ex cathedra, which means from the chair. And he can only speak from the chair on things that revolve around faith and morals. So, for example, if the Pope tells Catholics that you have to eat dinner with this certain kind of fork, that doesn't revolve around faith or morals, so that's not something that Catholics have to accept as 100% truth. That's something that is the Pope's opinion, and a lot of people take that to heart because he's a holy man, or is supposed to be a holy man. But it's not something that we have to accept as doctrine. And actually, popes have only spoken ex cathedra and spoken infallibly 2 times in the whole history of the church. And the Catholic Church has been around for 2,000 years, so only 2 times has that happened. The first time was actually explaining why the Pope can speak from the chair infallibly, and the second time was about a doctrine about Mary being a virgin until she was taken up into heaven, and that she was born sinless and didn't sin for the rest of her life. So those are the 2 times that the Pope has even spoken with infallibility, and it's not all of the time. Now, the role of the Pope is something else that people don't really seem to get, and I think that in diving into the Old Testament, we can actually see why the Pope is found not only in the New Testament when proclaimed by Jesus, but also in the times of David. So in the time of David, there were kings, obviously. David was a king, but there was also someone who was there kind of as the right-hand man as the king. And this person would be kind of the vicar, the placeholder for the king whenever the king was away, because the king would go and travel to different nations. Sometimes he just wouldn't be at the kingdom to be able to rule, so he would appoint this person to be in his space whenever he wasn't there. And the ceremonial term for this person back in the Old Testament would be the key holder. And the key holder would act in place of the king whenever he was gone. This was well known to Jesus and all of the apostles because they had obviously studied the Old Testament as Jewish people, and this is something that would have been prevalent in their mind, and that's something that we need to know and kind of grab onto when we move into the second part, which is the papacy in Scripture. So in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and specifically in this part, Peter, whose name was originally Simon. And in Matthew 16, he says to Simon, he says, your name is Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. I will give you the keys to the kingdom, and the gates of hell will never prevail against it. So unless Jesus is moving his disciples and his apostles in a different way, in a way that's not from the truth, he's giving Peter the keys to the kingdom here. Not saying that he is God, not saying that he is 100% true in everything that he says, but giving him the keys to be the vicar for when Jesus is ascended into heaven and isn't with the apostles physically. He's allowing Peter to act in his stead, not as God again, but as the head of the church. And that is furthered by when Peter gets the name of Peter, which means rock. So this would be a very unfamiliar name for Jesus to give Simon, but he says, your name is Peter, or rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. So we see in Scripture this kind of notion to Peter being not only the leader of the apostles, which he obviously is throughout Scripture, but that Jesus is giving him this special position in the church as the first pope. And then Peter hands that down to the next pope, and so on and so forth, all the way to Pope Francis today. But just a little snippet of how Jesus actually did institute a church. He instituted a hierarchy in that church, and the papacy started with Peter, and is so explicitly talked about in scriptures.